everyone, I am Deepika Santdasani, your host and you're watching Risk and Reality. Over the past few years, the business term has rapidly moved from niche boardroom conversations to being one of the biggest drivers of corporate expansion in India. There are really no brownie points for guessing this. It is the Global Capability Centers or GCCs. From finance to strategy, innovation to technology, GCCs are rapidly and increasingly becoming the backbone of global enterprises in India. In today's conversation, we are going to be talking about how the ecosystem of GCC has reshaped the future of finance, talent, governance, and business leaderships. For this conversation, we are joined by someone who comes with a knowledge of about 15 years in tax consulting, finance, and business transformations. She sits at the center of one of the biggest corporate stories in the world, and a successful one at that, which is the Global Capability Centers. We hear about it on a daily basis. We've seen a lot of posts on her LinkedIn feeds, but she's living it, implementing it every single day. She comes with an experience of about a decade in consulting. She later went on to be the head of financial shared services at a Goldman-backed company before transitioning into the GCC ecosystem. She currently serves as the director at ANSR and is guiding the global capability centers in terms of expansion and scalability in India. Beyond corporate leadership, she is somebody who believes in mentoring CA aspirants. She has spoken at a lot of industry forums, including the recent ICAI GCC Summit. She believes in advocating greater financial literacy and leadership among women in finance. She's somebody who's going to speak on GCCs with us today and share insights about how she has driven the GCC as an environment and ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Neha Karda. Thank you so much, Neha, and we're so happy to have you on this podcast of Risk and Reality.
Thank you, Deepika. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was just thinking how all us finance professional chartered accountants do our work really quietly without anybody noticing. And I think we really deserve a platform like this to speak, to know what's happening. So I'm really excited to be here.
So happy to have you, Neha. Thank you so much for being here. So Neha, I want to begin this conversation with really understanding the role of finance in GCCs because the nature has really evolved. We as finance professionals, we have in the past only focused on competencies in terms of, say, traditional controllership, really, right? But I know that GCC is more driven towards AI. It focuses on digital nuances rather than traditional or conventional methods that we rather focused on earlier. So in a GCC-driven environment, what would you say are the competencies that are really non-negotiable for us finance professionals?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So let's talk about the basics first, the simple stuff. So the qualification, the CA qualification itself is such an incredible foundation. Everything from technical depth, the rigor, to solve the structure in a chaotic environment, to work in complex organizations. All of that is practically inbuilt while we are doing our course, right? And that lays an incredible foundation for everything that we do onwards and upwards. Now, in the GCC ecosystem, I'd like to talk about a couple of things which require chartered accountants to upskill one step beyond. And the three things that I really want to speak about, I think first is business partnering, like you were mentioning. So in a traditional setup phase where a controller was only required to close the monthly accounts or sit in business review meetings, that's no longer the norm. Because CEOs, CFOs, IT heads who are sitting across the table in global organizations really want to know the story behind the numbers. So just putting the numbers up on a spreadsheet is no longer the norm. You really have to tell the story, you have to lay down the context, and that's what organizations are now understanding. So that's a very differentiated skill, and that is something finance professionals need to work on. The second thing that I can think of is, the regulatory breadth. And I'm calling it breadth and not depth, because the moment you focus on one vertical, you're a specialist. And this is not the era of specialists, this is the era of generalists. So to give you an example, just in the GCC ecosystem, for example, knowing all the touch points between FDI, FEMA, between transfer pricing, tax incentive zones, your SCZs, STPI, DTAs, as well as, the income tax filing, risks, governance, control. So the whole breadth is where the touch points are needed, and this needs to be a very unique skill. The recent amendment in the new wage code, you would have seen, it just does not impact HR professionals or HRBP people. It has an impact on gratuity, it has an impact on FEMA, it has an impact on a whole ecosystem. So just looking at problems from a macro lens rather than what focuses just on finance and tax alone is the skill of the hour. And I think the last point is very close to what you asked: digital first AI economy. Yes, and I talk about a very important word here. It's called technology fluency. Again, I'm not saying that you're a CA and you should learn how to code off the bat. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying you should be fluent enough to know how an ERP works, how the information is flowing from and out of the ERP. What are the requirements and setbacks of AI and automation tools, what they can and cannot do for you, and just how the data that you are putting in ERPs is being run across the organization, what is getting presented in front of the board, what the FPA professionals are using, what your HR is using. All of that becomes an important aspect. So if you are not able to translate this data into a story, you'll always be dependent on someone else to do it for you, and usually they are the people who are sitting in meetings and not you. So the depth is there, the foundation is there. It is just about thinking a little bit curiously, thinking outside the syllabus, and really polishing yourself to match that game. That's important.
That is amazing. I think that really brings so much insight, like you said, the breadth to the information. That actually leads me swiftly to the next question, which is basically, we as finance professionals in GCC, really, we focus on the depth, like you said. We kind of underestimate certain risks which are more financial and regulatory driven, right? So what would you say are the risks from a finance and regulatory arbitrage perspective, which the organization shouldn't underestimate, particularly in a GCC environment?
I think one thing to understand is that the GCC ecosystem is fairly matured in the country now. So when I'm sitting across the room with global organizations, they're asking really pointed and structured questions. They already know the game. They have a lot of players already in the market. So they know what the landscape is like, and their questions are very pointed, very direct. And to be honest, the kind of questions they ask is like the biggest learning curve for me, because I really learn a lot when they are asking these kinds of questions. I think there is a lot of enthusiasm in setup. Most of the organizations are getting it right in terms of the questions, in terms of the informed decision making. What is the need of the hour in terms of scale is to keep the same momentum while you are scaling that you had at the time of setup. So let's take transfer pricing for an example. If you are scaling from 50 to 500 FTEs, then probably the substance of the transactions is increasing, the scope of services is increasing, the leadership's responsibility is increasing, and all of that needs to be baked in your transfer pricing study, FAR analysis. Your transfer pricing study should reflect the actual work that is being done. Compliance you were talking about, and what compliance looks at 50 does not look the same at 500, and this is a very important aspect. So I think finance professional, chartered accountant should sit in the room where scaling decisions are happening. It is important to be on ground to give inputs in terms of what compliance intelligence or landscape looks like, rather than just being the one at the receiving end, receiving mandate, okay, tomorrow we are scaling to 500. It should not work like that. So the finance intelligence is required at the time of decision making, and there is also a whole aspect of readiness that is required when you're scaling. So if these things are kept in mind, the foundation is great, the curiosity is maintained, and the same momentum is kept, the same lens is kept while the GCC is scaling, then I think that should solve the majority of the problem. So
that is wonderfully explained. When I hear of GCC as a word, the two words that come following with the word GCC is really support functions, back office support. But I've increasingly seen in the recent past that we are now, especially India, in terms of GCC, is now just not an extension of their global operations, but really focusing on being a strategic partner. So what would you say differentiates the one that is a back office support in comparison to the ones that are really strategic partners for the global operations?
I would gently push back on the norm of calling a GCC a back office or a strategic partner, because GCCs themselves are not seeing, them as something of this sort, and rightly so. What really matters, Deepika, is the design intent. So whether a GCC was created for the purpose of cost arbitrage, for the purpose of process excellency, or for the purpose of any other task or solving a problem, it's really the intent that's shaping the mandate. Now, irrespective of what the intent is, GCC leadership and ideas are now sitting in rooms that were not existent before. A lot of GCC and their work is feeding into global strategy. The volumes also speak a lot, because sometimes a global organization have 500 employees across the globe, but there are 700 people in the India GCC. So in one way or the other, a GCC is of strategic importance to the group. So that's always going to be there. So it's really about that the conversation about GCCs and their leadership getting a seat at the table inside the boardrooms, all that is real, all that is accelerating. Global enterprises are now recognizing India beyond cost arbitrage. That's a known story. We read it everywhere. So it is really an important story to tell, both in the Indian economy and the global enterprises.
So for GCCs really now, because like you give an example of a 50 FTE in comparison to a 500 FTE really, right? And we are focusing on multi-geographies. At this point in time, there are multiple business units, multi-jurisdictional environment that GCCs are really dealing and functioning in. Here, I really want to understand what would the role of a GRC professional really be in terms of reshaping the governance framework for GCC?
Yes, and that's a very fitted question for your podcast, Risks and Reality. There are several ways to look at it, Deepika. Again, I'd go back to the answer on basics, our foundation. So we are already built in a way that we are handling multidisciplinary, multi-governance landscapes. So if you look at GCC, there is the India compliance part, then there is a parent compliance part, depending on where they are located, US, Europe. There are Indian controls, compliance, regulatory mechanisms, then there is that of the group, there is SOX, controls, governance. So global enterprises place a lot of importance on internal controls and governance and risks, and this is one of the starting conversations that really happen. GRC professionals are very well equipped to be a party to these conversations. They are already adept in thinking on a multidisciplinary basis, whether it is gap adjustments, whether it's governance, whether it's risk. That a chartered accountant can tell between what a good and bad governance looks like. They can tell you when an audit, or they can tell you when a control that is failing and prevent it from becoming an audit finding. So I'm saying that GRC professionals, CAs, typically should sit in rooms where delegation of authority discussions are happening, where governance model is being decided. Their inputs should matter. So I'm saying that the space is huge. It's just that we are not claiming it enough, and we should really go one step forward in kind of claiming that space and kind of setting the norms before, rather than just being the norm and accepting what a governance framework was being decided. So that's the part.
That is wonderfully explained. I think GRC professionals, like you said, we in the prior podcasts as well, I always said that I want more boardrooms to invite us, and I would also want more GCCs to invite us to be strategic partners and really make use of the skills, as you mentioned, that we kind of have. So India is of course one of the most favorite global hubs, right, for GCCs. We are not just competing with really Bangalore, but we are also competing with many international destinations such as Dublin, Manila, right? So from all of this in the GCC ecosystem, what would you say truly differentiates a world-class GCC ecosystem beyond just like keeping in mind the cost efficiency or maybe the talent to access? What would you say differentiates India as one of the most favorite GCCs really?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So I'd still like to say, no matter how far we go, cost arbitrage and talent are still the most important factors in deciding a GCC or its location. But it'll also be interesting to know that the GCC scorecard for a location comes with a lot of parameters, right? What was the design intent? What services are you planning to deliver? where is the talent matching those services available, where is the density, where would you like your leadership to grow, in which city, what is your appetite for moving to tier 2, tier 3 cities, what is your appetite for other South Asian locations, Philippines, coming into the picture. Some GCCs are now opening near shore locations for GBS and GCCs. South America is becoming prominent. So there are trends that are coming, there will be coming in locations, but I think it really boils down to the intent, the mandate. Where do you see yourself growing, where your competitors are placed, if an ecosystem is mature enough to handle your requirement. So there will be a lot of players and there will be a lot of levers in the location scorecard. So that's not a one-dimensional decision. It generally involves a lot of things. But let me talk about Hyderabad a little bit, because I was born and raised here and I'm generally biased towards the city. Places like Hyderabad and Bangalore in India were already equipped with handling large IT firms, the Wipros, the Infosys, the TCS of the world. So the ecosystem was already there. Early 2000s, huge companies were doing IT services. So when GCCs came, it was a natural addition, right? So the landscape was already there. The GCCs came and they built it to it. The talent was available. So all of them played really well for locations like Hyderabad and Bangalore. And I think Hyderabad, you and me can talk to the infrastructure. It's been amazing how the city has developed. So it's like fantastic. So these levers do come into play, but I think in the end it boils down to what really the GCC was set out to do. So if they are really meeting their objectives, have the risk appetite, and the location supports it, then that location becomes a preferred choice. So that's in the sense.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neha. This has been such an insightful conversation. Really, I believe myself that India is not just growing, it's thriving in the GCC division, really. And I see it more of being not just an extension, really, but I see it being a strategic partner more than anything else. And it also opens up such frontiers of capabilities and opportunities for a lot of us GRC and finance professionals, and that's really interesting in the GCC ecosystem. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation of Risk and Reality, Neha.
Thank you, Deepika.
And for our viewers, if you like this episode, don't forget to like and share it with all the other people in your network. Like I always say, don't forget to follow your passion.